In February 1948, in a canyon deep inside Arizona's Superstition wilderness, a hiker found a human skeleton. The skeleton was tied inside a blanket. The skull was resting 30 feet away. When the Maricopa County coroner's jury convened to review the evidence and issue a cause of death, the ruling they released in writing was this: no evidence of foul play. That was not the first body found like that in those mountains. It would not be the last. My name is Alex, and if you've been with this channel for any length of time, you already know where we are going today. The Superstition Mountains sit about 40 miles east of downtown Phoenix, Arizona. They cover roughly 160,200 acres of designated federal wilderness. Most of that wilderness falls inside Pinal County. The western edge belongs to Maricopa County. On a map, they look like an ordinary stretch of Sonoran desert, peaks, canyons, the occasional water source, a few old mining tunnels sealed up 100 years ago. On the ground, the place has been killing people since before Arizona was a state. The reason people keep going in there is a story that a lot of you will already know. In 1891, a German immigrant named Jacob Waltz died in Phoenix. Waltz had spent the last 20 years of his life occasionally showing up in town with sacks of extraordinary gold ore, the richest anyone in Arizona had ever seen. He never told anyone where he got it. On his deathbed, he supposedly described the location to a neighbor who had been caring for him. Neither she nor anyone else has been able to find it in the 135 years since. That lost mine is the reason you have probably heard of these mountains. It is called the Lost Dutchman. What I want to talk about today is not the mine. I want to talk about the men who went looking for it and came back in pieces that no coroner in Arizona has ever wanted to explain. We're going to walk through 3 cases today. The first is a 66-year-old veterinarian from Washington, District of Columbia, who walked into these mountains in June 1931 carrying a map he said he had traced all the way back to a Mexican mining family. He disappeared. 6 months later, his skull was found under a Palo Verde tree, and the lead anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution examined it, compared it to dental records, and issued a written opinion that the skull had 2 bullet holes in it from a high-powered rifle fired at point-blank range. Arizona authorities never formally adopted his finding. The case has sat in an official gray zone for the next 95 years. The second is the headless skeleton in the blanket, the case I opened with. In June of 1947, a retired photographer with a crippled arm and a bad leg pays a helicopter pilot to fly him into the heart of the wilderness so he can find the mine. The pilot sets him down. The photographer walks into a canyon and is never seen alive again. The following February, what is left of him turns up tied inside a blanket with the skull 30 feet from the rest of the bones. The coroner rules it an accident. No one, in the 78 years since, has offered a rational theory for the blanket. And the third is more recent. In July of 2010, 3 men from Salt Lake City drove into the Superstition wilderness looking for the same mine. One of them had been lost in these same mountains the year before and rescued by a search team. He went back anyway and took 2 friends with him. The 3 of them vanished. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, the Pinal County Sheriff's Office, and a volunteer search team put roughly 100 people into the wilderness, on foot, on horseback, and in helicopters equipped with infrared cameras. For 6 months, that search finds nothing. Not one piece of gear, not a footprint, not a cartridge shell. Then the bodies turn up, and the Maricopa County medical examiner's ruling on 3 men who disappeared in 115-degree July heat is the word hypothermia. You won't want to miss this one. Before any of these cases, before Jacob Waltz, before the Spanish conquistadors who came through here in the 16th century. The Apache who lived in these canyons had their own name for the range. They said the peaks were a doorway to the lower world. They said a god of thunder lived in those cliffs and protected what was his. The Pima people, who called themselves the Akimel o Odom, the river people, warned settlers for generations that the mountains were cursed. They told stories about a hole somewhere in the peaks that led down into the underworld, and about things that came out of that hole to hunt men who wandered too far in. When the American farmers moved into the Salt River Valley in the 1800s and heard those stories, they did what settlers tend to do. They laughed. They took the word the tribes had used, superstition, and they hung it on the range like a label. They meant it as dismissal. 135 years later, Pinal County is still ruling bodies found tied inside blankets as no foul play. And the Apache elders in the region, the ones who still know these stories, are not surprised. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Thanks. Let me start with the veterinarian. Adolf Ruth was 66 years old in the summer of 1931. He was a retired United States government employee and a veterinarian by trade. He lived in Washington, D.C. He was also, by the standards of the day, and by any standard since, an amateur treasure hunter with a specific and stubborn obsession. Ruth had been hunting lost mines for decades before he ever heard about the superstitions. He had spent time in California looking for a legendary mine called the Lost Peg Leg, named for a one-legged prospector who supposedly discovered a mountain of gold and then died before anyone could pin down where. Ruth did not find that mine. Nobody has. But he caught the fever that has hollowed out better men than him, and he never shook it. The map that brought him to Arizona came through his son. Erwin C. Ruth was a veterinarian who worked as a cattle inspector in Mexico in the 1920s, helping Mexican ranchers eradicate a cattle tick infestation that had been devastating their herds. One of the families Erwin worked with was named Gonzalez. The Gonzalez family had been handing down across generations a small collection of hand-drawn mining maps. According to the family, the maps showed the locations of old Spanish-era gold mines scattered across the American Southwest, mines the Spanish had worked and then lost access to entirely when the Apache took back the land. The Gonzalez family gave Erwin Ruth the maps. They were a gift of gratitude. Erwin had no particular interest in them. He passed them to his father. One of the maps, Adolf Ruth came to believe, showed the lost Dutchman. I want you to picture this man, because the picture matters. Ruth was 66 years old. He walked with a cane. He had metal pins holding together one of his legs from a previous injury. He was planning to go alone into some of the roughest desert terrain in the state of Arizona in the month of June, when the daytime temperatures in the Superstitions regularly push past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Local ranchers who saw him off described him the way you describe your grandfather trying to climb a ladder. He was not physically equipped for this trip. He did not care. Ruth made his way to the ranch of a man named William A. Barkley. Everyone called him Tex. Barkley's spread bordered the Superstitions, and he knew the terrain as well as anyone alive. Barkley took one look at Ruth and tried, politely, to talk him out of going in at all. Ruth refused. Around June 14, 1931, two cowboys working for Barkley packed Ruth into the wilderness on horseback. They dropped him at Willow Spring, a permanent water source deep in West Boulder Canyon, inside Pinal County. They gave him his supplies. They turned the horses around and rode back out. That was the last time anyone saw Adolf Ruth alive. On June 18th, 4 days after the drop, Tex Barkley reported Ruth overdue and missing. Search parties went in the next day. They covered the country around Willow Spring. They walked the ridgelines. They checked the water sources. They found nothing. Not a shred of clothing. Not a canteen. Not a cane. For a 66-year-old disabled man in that terrain in June, the search should have been short. Men in that condition do not travel far. The search was not short. The search yielded nothing. Ruth's son, Erwin, offered a reward for information. The reward brought forward no credible leads. Summer gave way to fall. Fall gave way to winter. In most cases like this, the story would simply end there. A missing persons file in a county office. A family that never gets an answer. On December 10th, 1931, 6 months after Ruth walked into West Boulder Canyon, an archaeological expedition led by two men named Richie Lewis and George Holmes, sponsored by the Arizona Republic newspaper, was working in the Superstitions near a feature called the Spanish Racetrack at the north end of Bluff Springs Mountain. They were not looking for Ruth. They found him anyway, lying under a Palo Verde tree. Separated from any other human remains was a weathered human skull. The skull was approximately 6 miles from Ruth's last known camp. Now, here is where the case becomes something I want you to pay attention to, because the authority involved is the part that most retellings get wrong. The skull was not examined by some small-town county coroner. It was shipped across the country to a man named Alois Hrdlicka. If you do not recognize the name, and most people don't, here is who he was. Alois Hrdlicka was, at that time, the curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He was Czech-born, Harvard-educated, and by 1931 he was arguably the most respected human skeletal anatomy expert in the United States of America. When the federal government needed someone to identify human remains or examine skeletal trauma in a case of national interest, Hrdlicka was the man they called. This was not a weekend hobbyist. This was the top authority in the country. Hrdlicka received the skull in December 1931. He compared it to photographs of Adolf Ruth. He compared it to Ruth's dental records. He confirmed the identification. Then he examined 2 holes in the cranium. His written finding, reported in the newspapers of the day and preserved in multiple historical accounts since, was this: the holes were consistent with a shotgun or a high-powered rifle fired through the head at almost point-blank range. There was a small entry wound and a larger exit wound, exactly the pattern you would expect from a rifle round. Hrdlicka was not speculative. He stated it flatly. The man had been shot in the head at close range. On January 8, 1932, Tex Barkley and a deputy named Jeff Adams found the rest of Ruth's remains. They were in a small tributary canyon on the eastern slope of Blacktop Mesa, about 3/4 of a mile from where the skull had been found. The body had been scattered by scavengers. Most of it was still there. With the remains, they recovered Ruth's personal effects: his journal, the metal pins from his leg, a checkbook, and a pistol. The pistol was fully loaded. Every bullet was still in the cylinder. Inside the checkbook, written in Ruth's own handwriting, was a short note in Latin. It read, "Veni, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. Underneath the Latin, in pencil, was a single additional line, about 200 feet across from cave. Separately, weeks later, a bottle was recovered downstream along the Salt River. The bottle contained a second handwritten note. The handwriting was Ruth's. The note read, and I will quote it to you because this is his actual voice. "I'm sitting under a tree in a creek with leg broke. I've got to have help quick. Finder of this note, Please give it to Howard Peterson. P.S. Have found the lost Dutchman. One of the men who helped with the search that winter, who was one of the ranchers and neighbors the sheriff pulled in to walk the canyons, told the story like this, decades later, to anyone who would listen. He said the country out there does not take a 66-year-old man in June and move his skull 6 miles from his body in opposite directions without help. He said he had lived in that country his whole life, and he had never seen a coyote do anything like what was done to Adolf Ruth. He said the people on the search that year knew, all of them, that the official story was not the real one, and they knew it the minute Hrdlička's report came back. He said nobody talked about it much in town. He said it would have been bad for business. I cannot give you that man's name, and I am not going to make one up. But that account, the shape of it, the feeling of it, shows up again and again in the recollections of people who are on the ground in those mountains in the winter of 1931 and 1932. Arizona state authorities never formally adopted Hrdlička's finding. The official record of Adolf Ruth's death treats the cause as undetermined. The separation between skull and body was attributed, without evidence, to coyotes. I want to sit with that for a second. If Ruth shot himself in the head, which is what the suicide theory would require, then no bullet was missing from his pistol. That is a fact. The pistol came out of the canyon with every round still in it. A man cannot shoot himself in the head and then reload the gun after. If an animal killed him, then the animal was one that operates a high-powered rifle at almost point-blank range, according to the curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. That is a fact too. The state of Arizona, presented with those two facts, chose a third option. It chose to leave the case open and undetermined, and to never name what happened in writing. The man who actually examined the skull, the top skeletal anthropologist in America, said this was a homicide. Arizona filed his report and kept walking. That pattern, by the way, is not going to be a one-time thing. Hold on to it. Because 16 years later, in the same mountains, the state of Arizona is going to be presented with evidence that is, if anything, even harder to explain. And the state of Arizona is going to do the exact same thing. His name was James A. Cravey. He was 62 years old in the spring of 1947. He was a retired commercial photographer. He lived in a small house on West Polk Street in downtown Phoenix, just a short drive from the eastern foothills of the Superstitions, which he could see from his back porch on a clear day. Cravey was not a well man. One of his arms was almost useless from an old injury. One of his legs gave him constant trouble. Bad enough that it had forced him out of his photography career and into an early retirement he could not really afford. He was not, by any reasonable measure, someone who had any business hiking alone into remote desert wilderness in the summer. In May of 1947, Cravey told his neighbor and close friend, a man named C.W. Vanderfloot, that he had woken up that morning from a dream. In the dream, he had seen the location of the lost Dutchman mine. Not speculated, not guessed, seen. Cravey was convinced that the dream had been real, and that he now knew, with certainty, where the mine was hidden. Vanderfloot tried to talk him out of it. According to everything that has been written about this case since, Vanderfloot was not subtle. He told Cravey directly that he was not physically capable of the trip. He told him it was June in the Sonoran Desert. He told him men in perfect health had gone into those mountains and never come out. He told him the dream was a dream. Cravey listened, nodded, and went home and picked up the phone. He called a man named Edwin G. Montgomery, who was the owner and operator of a small outfit in Phoenix called Arizona Helicopter Services. Helicopters in 1947 were not what they are now. The technology was barely a decade out of the prototype stage. Civilians did not charter helicopters for recreational purposes. Cravey was going to be one of the earliest private citizens in Arizona to hire a helicopter for a treasure hunt. Possibly the earliest. Montgomery connected him with an experienced pilot named Charles Martins, who agreed to fly him in. Cravey packed methodically. He bought a backpack, a bedroll, hand tools, 50 feet of rope, food supplies, a set of cooking utensils, a large canteen, a pistol, and a compass. He paid Martins in advance. He told his friend Vanderfloot goodbye. On June 19, 1947, Martins trailered his helicopter out to a ranch called the Quarter Circle U, near the western boundary of the wilderness. From there, he lifted Cravey and his gear into the air and flew him a short distance, under 4 miles, into the heart of the Superstitions. He set Cravey down in La Barge Canyon, close to Weaver's Needle, which is a 1,000-foot volcanic spire that rises above the wilderness and serves as the most recognizable landmark in the entire range. Martins lifted off. The helicopter flew back out. Cravey waved. Cravey was supposed to find the mine, spend a week confirming the location, and then hike himself out on foot to US Highway 60, the road that runs between Apache Junction and Superior. That was the plan. On July 3, 1947, 2 weeks after his scheduled return, James A. Cravey was reported missing. On July 9th, a Maricopa County deputy named Travis Wall led a search posse into La Barge Canyon. They found Cravey's camp almost immediately. The bedroll was still laid out. The cooking gear was still stacked. The canteen was still there. His food cache was still intact. It looked to the men on that posse like Cravey had walked out of camp to find water or to check a nearby canyon and had never walked back. There was no pistol. There was no Cravey. The search continued through the rest of that summer and into the fall. Dozens of men on horseback walked every drainage within 10 miles of the drop point. Nothing. No tracks. No bones. No clothing. No sign that a 62-year-old, partially disabled man had walked anywhere. In February of 1948, 8 months after the helicopter dropped him off, a hiker who was off trail in a canyon some distance from Cravey's original camp found something. He found a human skeleton. The skeleton was not sprawled on the ground the way bodies in the wilderness usually are. The skeleton was tied inside a blanket. The skull was 30 feet away from the body. The Maricopa County coroner's jury was convened. The remains were examined. Identity was confirmed. It was Cravey. The jury then issued its ruling on cause of death. The exact wording preserved in the historical record was this: no evidence of foul play. I want you to pause for a second on that wording. Not undetermined, not pending investigation, not awaiting further evidence. No evidence of foul play. That is an affirmative statement. That is a coroner's jury looking at a human being wrapped in a blanket, with his skull positioned 30 feet from the rest of him, and saying, for the record, that nothing was done to him. The explanation floated at the time, the one the county quietly leaned on, was that coyotes had carried the skull. Coyotes do scavenge. Coyotes will separate bones from a decomposing body. That part is true. A man who was on Deputy Wall's posse in the summer of 1947 talked about this case years later. He did not want his name used. He said the thing that stuck with him was not the day they found the empty camp. It was the 8 months in between the empty camp and the discovery of the blanket. He said he went back into La Barge Canyon twice during those months, on his own, because something about that empty camp did not sit right. He said the canyon was quiet in a way that desert canyons are not usually quiet. He said he had hunted those mountains his whole life, and he knew what the ambient noise was supposed to sound like. Wind in the Ocotillo, the clicks of insects, a raven calling from the cliffs, and La Barge Canyon in the summer of 1947, he said, was wrong. Too quiet, and stayed wrong for weeks. He could not explain it. He said he told his wife about it once and never brought it up again. I cannot give you his name. I will not invent one. But his account is not isolated. Let me come back to the coyote theory for a second, because I want to be fair to the Maricopa County coroner's jury of 1948. Coyotes do carry skulls. A coyote could plausibly separate a human skull from a decomposing human body and drag it 30 feet. That part of the theory is not crazy. But a coyote cannot tie a man inside a blanket. That is not a thing coyotes do. That is not a thing any animal in the Sonoran Desert does. The blanket, the fact that Cravey's skeletal remains were wrapped inside a blanket when they were found, is the fact that the coyote theory does not touch. That is the fact the Maricopa County coroner's jury in 1948 did not address in their ruling and did not mention in their reasoning, and that no Arizona state authority in the 78 years since has ever offered a formal explanation for. Who wrapped James A. Cravey in a blanket before his skull ended up 30 feet away from the rest of him? I don't know. It remains a mystery. But I will tell you this. 16 years before Cravey vanished, a 66-year-old veterinarian named Adolf Ruth walked into the same mountains with a map to the same mine. Ruth's skull ended up 3/4 of a mile from his body. The anthropologist who examined it said he had been shot with a high-powered rifle at point-blank range. Arizona authorities never formally accepted that finding. They preferred the coyote theory. Two men, 16 years apart, both hunting the lost Dutchman, both found with their heads separated from their bodies. In both cases, the authorities ruled accident or undetermined, and in both cases, the physical evidence pointed somewhere else entirely. You start to see the pattern. Before I tell you about the three men from Utah, I have to tell you about the year before. In the summer of 2009, a 48-year-old man named Curtis Merworth drove from Salt Lake City, Utah, into the Superstition wilderness, looking for the lost Dutchman mine. Merworth was an experienced outdoorsman. He knew what he was doing. He went in prepared. He got lost. Not briefly lost. Not disoriented for an afternoon lost. He got deep into the wilderness, dehydrated, no idea where he was, lost, and a Maricopa County search and rescue team had to go in after him. They found him. They brought him out. Merworth went home to Salt Lake City. If you have ever been lost in rough country, genuinely lost, not cell signal is weak lost, you know that it is an experience you do not forget. For most people, it is also an experience that ends the hobby. Most people who have to be rescued from a wilderness do not go back. Curtis Merworth went back. He not only went back, he talked two of his friends into coming with him. And on July 11th, 2010, almost exactly 1 year after his first rescue, three men from Salt Lake City, Utah, entered the Superstition wilderness together, on foot, to look for the lost Dutchman mine. Their names, and I want to say them clearly, because these men had families. These men had people at home who are still grieving them 15 years later. Their names were Curtis Merworth, age 49, Ardian Charles, age 66, and Malcolm Meeks, age 51. Charles was the oldest man in the group, a 66-year-old man walking into that terrain in July. July in central Arizona is not a season, it is a hazard. Daytime high temperatures in the Superstition wilderness in the week of July 11th. 2010 were recorded at between 110 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not air temperature in the shade. That is exposed ground temperature on bare rock that has been sitting in the Sonoran sun since dawn. A human body cannot maintain core temperature under those conditions for more than a few hours without active hydration and shade. The three men walked in anyway. They did not come out. When the three of them were reported overdue, the response from the authorities was immediate, and it was significant. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office opened a full-scale search and rescue operation. The Pinal County Sheriff's Office, covering the eastern portion of the wilderness, opened its own operation in parallel. Both counties coordinated with Federal Forest Service personnel in Tonto National Forest. And the Superstition Search and Rescue Team, the volunteer group that has worked these mountains for decades, went in behind them. At the peak of that search, approximately 100 people were actively looking for Merworth, Charles, and Meeks. I want you to hold that number, 100 searchers, because the scale of that effort matters when I tell you the rest of this. The searchers were on foot in the canyons. They were on horseback on the ridgelines. They were in helicopters, flying grid patterns across the wilderness at low altitude. The helicopters were equipped with infrared cameras, forward-looking infrared, the same technology law enforcement uses to find fugitives at night. A human body on the ground in the Superstitions, even an unconscious one, would show up on an infrared camera against the cool evening desert, like a light bulb in a dark room. They had tracker dogs, they had spotters, they had topographic maps marked with every drainage, every cave, every abandoned mine shaft, every water source. The MCSO Search and Rescue Command Post was formally established on or around July 13, 2010, and operated continuously for 5 days. By the time the command post was taken down on July 18th, 1 week after the three men disappeared, the search had covered every major canyon in the area Merworth had been lost in the previous summer, plus the surrounding terrain in a widening spiral. They found nothing. Not a backpack, not a water bottle, not a footprint on the game trails, not an empty shell casing from the pistol that the men were believed to be carrying, not a scrap of fabric caught on a cholla. Nothing. Three men in a 160,200-acre wilderness, and after 100 searchers had walked it for 5 days, there was not a single physical trace that they had ever been there. The MCSO command post shut down. The volunteer searches continued. The Superstition Search and Rescue Team, led by a man named Robert Cooper, did not stop. Cooper is not the kind of search commander who gives up. SSAR kept sending volunteers into the wilderness every weekend through the end of July, through August, through the fall. They walked the same country the county searchers had already walked. They walked new country. They checked abandoned mine shafts. They checked canyon bottoms after the monsoon rains. They continued into October. They continued into November. They continued into December. As of January 1st, 2011, nearly 6 months after Merworth, Charles, and Meeks had disappeared into that wilderness, not a single clue had been found. SSAR's own official written account of the search, which you can still read on their website if you want, describes the situation in exactly this language. It says, and I am quoting them directly, "It was as if they had vanished from the face of the earth." That is a volunteer search team, writing about its own work, saying it could not explain what had happened. A volunteer who worked those SSAR searches through the fall of 2010 described it this way. He said the hardest part was not the heat, and it was not the terrain, and it was not the weekends he gave up to be out there. The hardest part, he said, was the not finding anything. He said he had worked searches before. He said searches end, almost always, with you finding something, a piece of gear, a partial track, a personal item that tells you which direction the person went. He said this one never gave them anything. He said you would come out of the canyon at the end of a Sunday, having walked 10 miles in Arizona winter sun, and you would have found nothing. And the next weekend, you would do it again, and you would find nothing again. He said it started to feel, after a while, like the country was actively refusing to produce them, like it was holding on to them. That is one volunteer's words. He did not want his name used. I am not going to invent one. On January 8, 2011, exactly 6 months after the disappearance, a hiker who was off trail in an area that the searchers had already walked multiple times reported finding human remains. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office Mountain Rescue Team and helicopter went out that Saturday afternoon. They recovered 2 sets of skeletal remains. Identification through dental records and personal effects confirmed them as Ardian Charles and Malcolm Meeks. A week later, on January 15, 2011, the SSAR team returned to the general area and worked northward toward Black Mesa. About 3/4 of a mile north of the first recovery site, they came across a debris field. In it, they found a human bone. Maricopa County deputies David Bremson and Jesse Robinson supervised the recovery of the third body. A wallet found with the remains identified the man as Curtis Merworth. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office performed the autopsies. The ruling on all 3 men was cause of death consistent with exposure, specifically hypothermia. Hypothermia is what kills you when your core body temperature drops too far below normal. It happens in cold conditions. It is the official cause of death for 3 men who walked into the Superstition wilderness on a day when the ground temperature was 115 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what to do with that ruling. I've read it 3 times. I've read the news coverage. I've read the SSAR account. I've read the sheriff's office statements. And I cannot find a version of that ruling that does not require you to believe that 3 men who disappeared on July 11th somehow survived in the wilderness without water and without gear and without being seen by 100 searchers or any of their helicopters or infrared cameras, long enough for the temperature to drop enough to kill them through cold exposure. I cannot find that version. Nobody has offered that version. The ruling is hypothermia, in July, in central Arizona, in 115-degree heat, and the additional thing nobody has explained, the thing that is sitting there in the timeline, in plain sight, is the 6 months, 100 searchers, helicopters with forward-looking infrared, tracker dogs, and for 6 months the wilderness did not produce a single physical trace. And then, in the first week of January 2011, all 3 bodies turned up within 3/4 of a mile of each other, in country that had already been searched. Where were they for those 6 months? Nobody from Maricopa County has ever answered that question. So here is where we have ended up. 3 cases: Adolf Ruth in 1931, James Cravey in 1947, Curtis Merworth, Ardian Charles, and Malcolm Meeks in 2010. That is 79 years between the first case and the last. Different men, different eras, different weapons and tools and technology. A 66-year-old veterinarian with a cane and a map from Mexico. A 62-year-old photographer who chartered a helicopter because he had a dream. 3 men from Utah carrying modern gear into a wilderness with 100 searchers and an infrared camera on their tail. The pattern is the same every time. A body is found in a condition the official ruling cannot honestly account for. A skull shot at point-blank range, according to the top anthropologist in the country, ruled undetermined. A human being wrapped inside a blanket, with the skull positioned 30 feet away. ruled no evidence of foul play. 3 men missing for 6 months in a wilderness that had 100 people walking it, found within 3/4 of a mile of each other, ruled hypothermia in 115-degree July heat. In each case, the evidence on the ground and the ruling on paper do not meet. In each case, the counties with jurisdiction, Pinal, Maricopa, the Arizona State Medical Examiner, have closed the file rather than name what the evidence raises. That pattern has held for most of a century. These are 3 documented cases. There are dozens more that I have not told you about tonight. There was Dr. John Burns, a physician from Oregon, found shot to death in the Superstitions in February of 1951, ruled accidental. There was Joseph Kelly, who disappeared in 1952 and whose body was found near Weaver's Needle 2 years later, shot from directly above, ruled accidental. There was Hilmer Charles Bowen, a Utah prospector, found in a shallow grave with a bullet in his back in January of 1961, ruled suicide. There was Jay Clapp, a recluse who lived in a cave in the Superstitions, who vanished in 1961 and whose headless skeleton was recovered 3 years later. Cause of death, per the official record, unknown. There was Jesse Capon, a hotel bellhop from Denver, Colorado, who walked into these mountains in December of 2009 and was not found for 3 years. And when he was found, his skeleton was wedged on a ledge 35 feet up a sheer cliff face, in a crevice that investigators openly admitted they could not explain him reaching. The list is long. The list goes back to 1891. The list is still open. Before any of this, before Waltz, before the Spanish, the Apache and the Pima were telling anyone who would listen that something was wrong in those peaks. The Apache said a door to the lower world opened somewhere in those canyons, and that the things that lived on the other side of it came out from time to time. The Pima said the mountains were cursed. They said things lived there that did not belong to the surface world. They warned the settlers. The settlers laughed and named the range Superstition. 135 years later, Pinal County is still issuing rulings that do not match the physical evidence, and the Apache elders in the region are not surprised. They have been telling us for a very long time. Nobody in authority has ever named what is killing men in the Superstition Mountains, but the people who were here first knew. They just used a different word for it. If you made it this far, and I hope you did, because this one has been weighing on me, I want to hear from you. Comment Superstition below so I know who made it to the end. If you are new to this channel, hit subscribe. We are going to keep covering the places and the cases that the authorities have closed without answering. If you have been with me a while, you already know what we are doing here. I love you all. See you in the next one.